I need to tell you something about Robert and Marian before you fall in love with them. Because you will. They're that couple, married since 1964, still holding hands, still finishing each other's sentences. But here's the question they never asked themselves on camera, and I'm going to ask it for them. Were they happy, or did they just stay? Robert is 82. Marian is 80. They met at a church dance in Scranton, Pennsylvania, got married 4 months later, and built a life that looks, from the outside, like the kind of marriage your grandparents told you doesn't exist anymore. 3 kids. A house they paid off. 60 years without the word divorce ever becoming real. When they sit together on that familiar couch and count their mistakes for you, you can see the decades in their gestures, the way he touches her shoulder when she starts crying, the way she steadies him when he forgets a word. Here's what we're going to do in this video, and it's different from what you're used to seeing on channels like this. We're going to honor every word Robert and Marian said. We're going to respect the 6 decades of lived experience sitting in that room. But we're also going to name something those other channels won't, that Robert and Marian built their marriage in an America where divorce was social suicide, where Marian couldn't open a credit card without Robert's signature until 1974, and where couples therapy was something only troubled people did. They didn't just choose to stay together for 60 years. In many ways, especially in those early decades, staying was the only option their world presented as acceptable. That doesn't make their lessons worthless. It makes them complicated. And complicated is where the real wisdom lives. By the end of this video, you'll have 5 relationship principles that pull from Robert and Marian's real experience and hold up when you run them through modern psychology, economic reality, and relationships where both people have the genuine freedom to leave. Not their grandfather's marriage advice. Not generic therapy speak. Something in between. Something updated. Let's start with the one they listed first, the mistake Robert says cost them 15 years of closeness they can't get back. Robert kept a mental list for 15 years. Trash duty. Lawn maintenance. Everything he fixed around the house. And every time Marian asked him to help with one more thing, he'd add it to the invisible ledger, this running calculation of who was doing more, who was sacrificing more, who deserved more credit. He never said it out loud, not directly, but Marian felt it. She felt the resentment sitting between them like a wall. And she was keeping her own list. Every meal she cooked. Every school pickup. Every middle-of-the-night fever check. Every single birthday she remembered for both their families. When Robert would come home exhausted and visible about it, she wanted to scream. But she didn't. She just added it to her list. Here's the context that shaped that scorekeeping. Robert and Marian got married in 1964, at the tail end of an era when marriage was explicitly structured as a gender-based division of labor. Robert's job was breadwinner. Marian's job was everything else. And that everything else was invisible labor, no salary, no retirement plan, no social recognition beyond she keeps a nice home. The culture told Robert his contributions were the ones that mattered because they came with a paycheck. The culture told Marian that her contributions didn't count as work because they happened inside the house. So of course they kept score. They were both trying to prove their value in a system that had already decided only one of them was economically valuable. Here's what the research says. Dr. John Gottman, who has studied thousands of couples over 4 decades, identifies contempt as one of the 4 horsemen of relationship breakdown. And scorekeeping? Scorekeeping is contempt in its infancy. It's the voice that says, I do more than you, which means I'm better than you, which means you don't deserve me. Gottman's data shows that when couples fall into chronic scorekeeping, they stop seeing each other as partners and start seeing each other as competitors or, worse, as adversaries. The antidote isn't fairness. It's what Gottman calls turning toward instead of keeping score, a fundamental reorientation where you stop measuring contributions and start noticing bids for connection. Stop counting contributions. Start naming what you need. The wisdom isn't that you should ignore fairness or let yourself be exploited. The wisdom is that marriage isn't a ledger. Some seasons, one person carries more because the other person is underwater. The goal isn't 50-50 every single week. The goal is both people feeling like their needs matter and their contributions are seen. Not compared. Seen. Marian is a planner. She makes lists. She schedules everything. She needs to know what's happening 3 weeks from now or she feels untethered. Robert is spontaneous. He lives in the moment. He hates committing to plans because it feels like closing doors. And for decades, Robert's word, decades, they fought about this. Marian would get frustrated that Robert wouldn't commit to anything. Robert would get frustrated that Marian couldn't just relax. She'd say, "Why can't you just be more organized?" He'd say, "Why can't you just loosen up?" They were trying to turn each other into different people. Marian thought if she just explained it clearly enough, Robert would understand why planning mattered and he'd change. Robert thought if he just showed her how much joy spontaneity brought, she'd stop needing control. Neither of them changed. They just both felt inadequate and misunderstood for 40 years. Robert and Marian formed this expectation in an era before we had language for personality typology, before Myers-Briggs entered the cultural vocabulary, before we understood that some of these differences aren't choices, they're wiring. The 1960s and 70s didn't have a framework for "this is just how I'm built." You had character. You had discipline. If you were disorganized, you were lazy. If you were rigid, you were uptight. Everything was a moral failure, not a personality difference. So they pathologized each other's natural rhythms for decades. What does modern psychology tell us? Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by researchers like Sue Johnson, suggests that many of our relational patterns, how we handle uncertainty, how we seek security, how we respond to change, are formed early and run deep. Marian's need to plan is likely rooted in what attachment researchers would call an anxious attachment strategy. The world feels safer when I can see what's coming. Robert's spontaneity might reflect a more avoidant attachment pattern or simply a secure attachment where uncertainty doesn't trigger panic. Neither is wrong. They're just different nervous systems trying to find safety in different ways. The research also tells us something crucial: you can't change someone's attachment style through criticism. You can only create enough safety that they can slowly expand their range. Accept who your partner is, and tell them who you're becoming. Robert and Marian eventually landed on a compromise where Marian handles the structure and Robert handles the surprises. But here's what's missing from their framing: acceptance isn't the same as resignation. You're allowed to grow. You're allowed to ask your partner to grow. The difference is you're not trying to fundamentally rewire them into someone else. You're saying, "I accept that you're spontaneous, and I need you to understand that my planning isn't control, it's how I feel safe." That's the conversation they needed 40 years earlier. And it's the conversation you need now, before you waste decades resenting someone for being exactly who they've always been. Marian calls herself so guilty of this one. For decades, she let things build up. Small annoyances. Small hurts. She wouldn't say anything because she didn't want to start a fight. She'd think, it's not worth it. Just let it go. But you can't let everything go. It doesn't actually go anywhere. It just piles up inside you until something tiny sets you off. She tells the story of completely losing it over milk. Robert forgot to pick up milk, and suddenly she's yelling about how he never listens, how he always forgets things, and Robert's standing there thinking, this is about milk. But it wasn't about milk. It was about 6 months of feeling unheard, and the milk was just the final straw. If she had told Robert earlier, calmly, when you forget things I ask you to do, it makes me feel like you don't value my time, they could have talked about it. Instead, she stayed quiet until she couldn't anymore, and then it came out as an attack. Here's the context, and this is where I need to push back on Marian's framing, respectfully. Marian says she didn't speak up because she didn't want to start a fight. But let's be specific about what era taught her that silence. Marian was socialized in the 1940s and 50s, when girls were explicitly taught that anger was unladylike, that a good wife doesn't nag, that keeping the peace was her job. The cultural script was clear. Your husband works hard, don't burden him with complaints, keep the home pleasant, swallow your needs. This wasn't Marian being conflict avoidant by nature, this was Marian doing exactly what her world told her good women do. And Robert? He was taught that men don't talk about feelings, that you handle problems by fixing them or ignoring them, that long emotional conversations are what women do to each other, not what you do with your wife. So they were both operating under scripts that made authentic emotional communication almost impossible. What does the research tell us? Psychologist Dr. Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy, talks about what she calls protest polkas, the pattern where one partner shuts down and the other escalates, and both are desperate to be heard but neither knows how to reach the other. The silent partner isn't withholding to punish. They're often overwhelmed, under-resourced in emotional language, or terrified that if they start talking they'll say something that destroys everything. The exploding partner isn't being dramatic. They're doing what Johnson calls a secondary emotion. The anger is what you see, but underneath it is usually fear, hurt, or loneliness that feels too vulnerable to name directly. Johnson's work shows that the solution isn't just speak up earlier. It's learning to speak from the vulnerable place underneath the complaint. Not you never listen, but when you forget, I feel invisible, and that scares me because I need to matter to you. Say the hard thing before it becomes the explosive thing, but say the real thing, not the safe thing. Marian is right that silence until explosion doesn't work. But here's what's missing. The hard thing isn't you forgot the milk. The hard thing is I don't feel important to you. That's the sentence that's actually hard to say. Most couples argue about logistics, chores, money, schedules, because it feels safer than naming the emotional truth underneath. You forgot the milk becomes a fight about respect, but nobody actually says the word respect because that would make you too vulnerable. Modern couples have language Robert and Marian never had. Use it. Not to attack. To reveal. After about 25 years, Robert and Marian fell into routine. They knew each other so well, they'd been through so much, and they assumed the relationship would sustain itself. They stopped dating each other. They stopped really talking beyond logistics. Who's picking up groceries? What time is the dentist appointment? Did you pay the electric bill? Robert's words, we became roommates who occasionally slept together. The scary thing, Marian says, is it happened so gradually they didn't even notice. There was no single moment where they decided to stop trying. It just slowly faded, the romance, the curiosity about each other, the effort. They got comfortable, and comfortable became complacent. What woke them up was watching their friends divorce after 38 years. The wife told Marion they'd been fine. Just fine. Not happy, not connected. Just existing next to each other. That terrified Marion. So they made changes. Dinner together at the table, not in front of the TV. Real questions again. Evening walks. Date nights, not fancy, but intentional. Here's what I need to name, because it matters. Robert and Marion built their marriage with economic stability that most modern couples cannot access. Robert worked one job that supported a family of 5, paid for a house, and eventually funded retirement. Marion worked as a nurse, but in that era her income was considered supplemental, not essential. By the time they hit that 25-year autopilot phase, their kids were grown, their mortgage was nearly paid, and they had the luxury of being bored. They could focus on us because they weren't drowning in economic precarity. Today, fewer than 30% of American households can survive on one income. Most couples are working multiple jobs, managing childcare logistics that cost as much as rent, and trying to keep their heads above water financially. The autopilot Robert and Marion fell into was complacency. The autopilot most modern couples experience is exhaustion. That's not the same thing, and the solution isn't the same either. What does research say about marital maintenance? Dr. Arthur Aaron's work on relationship satisfaction shows that novelty and shared new experiences are what keep long-term relationships feeling alive. His studies found that couples who engage in novel, challenging activities together report higher relationship satisfaction than couples who just spend time together doing familiar things. It's not about the amount of time, it's about whether that time pulls you out of routine and asks you both to be present. The research also shows that what Aaron calls self-expansion, the feeling that your partner helps you grow and become a better version of yourself, is one of the strongest predictors of long-term satisfaction. When that stops, when you're no longer expanding each other's worlds, the relationship starts to feel like a cage, even if it's a comfortable one. Tend your relationship, but don't mistake emotional labor for connection. Robert and Marion are right that marriage needs active attention. But here's the complication. For modern couples, especially couples where both partners work full-time, date night can become just one more item on an impossible to-do list. One more thing you're failing at. The answer isn't to replicate Robert and Marion's evening walks when you're getting home at 8 p.m. and still have to make dinner, help with homework, and somehow not collapse. The answer is to find the smallest unit of connection that feels like oxygen, not obligation. Maybe it's not a 20-minute walk. Maybe it's 10 minutes of morning coffee where you actually look at each other and ask one real question. Maybe it's a shared playlist. Maybe it's a standing agreement that Friday night, after the kids are asleep, you sit on the couch and debrief your week with full attention for 30 minutes. Tend it. But tend it in a way that works for the actual life you have, not the life Robert and Marion had in 1995. When Robert and Marion would argue, especially in those middle years, it felt like they were opponents. Like they were each trying to win, to prove they were right and the other person was wrong. Every disagreement became a battle, and battles have winners and losers. But marriage doesn't work like that, Marion says. If one person wins and one person loses, you both lose, because you're supposed to be partners moving through life together, not competitors trying to defeat each other. The turning point came when their middle son Daniel moved back home at age 40. He'd lost his job. His marriage was falling apart. He was broken. Robert and Marion had different ideas about how to support him, but they couldn't fight about it. This was their son. So they talked. Really talked. They listened to each other. They compromised. And helping Daniel reminded them, they're not Robert versus Marion. They're Robert and Marion together, facing whatever comes. Every problem, every decision, every challenge, they're supposed to tackle it together. Here's the moment I want you to sit with. Daniel moved home because his own marriage was collapsing, and watching their son's relationship fall apart forced Robert and Marion to remember they were on the same team. But here's what they don't say, what maybe they can't see. Daniel's marriage fell apart in part because he had the option to leave. Robert and Marion's marriage survived in part because, for most of their 60 years, leaving wasn't really an option, not emotionally, not socially, not financially. I don't say that to diminish their bond. I say it because it complicates the story they're telling about what saved them. Being on the same team is easier when you can't leave the team. The real test of partnership is what happens when both people have genuine freedom to walk away and they choose to stay anyway. What does the research tell us about collaborative versus adversarial conflict? Dr. John Gottman's work again, he distinguishes between what he calls perpetual problems and solvable problems. 69% of relationship conflicts are perpetual. They're based on fundamental personality differences that will never be fully resolved. Solvable problems are about logistics. The couples who thrive aren't the ones who have fewer perpetual problems. They're the ones who've learned to have dialogue about them instead of gridlock. Dialogue means you're both trying to understand each other's dreams, fears, and needs underneath the surface disagreement. Gridlock means you're both dug into positions and waiting for the other person to surrender. Gottman's research shows that what predicts success isn't how much you agree. It's whether you approach disagreement as two people trying to solve a puzzle together or as two people in a courtroom trying to win a case. You're on the same team, but make sure you're playing the same game. Robert and Marion are absolutely right that adversarial energy destroys relationships. The moment you start keeping a mental score of who won this fight, you've already lost the marriage. But here's what's underneath their story. They discovered they were on the same team because a crisis forced them to unite against a common external threat, their son's suffering. That's real. That works. But what about all the conflicts that aren't about external threats? What about the fights that are about the two of you having genuinely different values, different priorities, different visions for your life? Being on the same team doesn't mean you always want the same thing. It means you've agreed that the goal is both people feeling heard and neither person feeling steamrolled. It means sometimes the solution is compromise, and sometimes the solution is we're going to disagree about this forever, but we're going to do it with respect. Modern couples need to define what same team actually means when you don't have an external enemy to unite you. Here's what strikes me looking at all 5 of these together. Robert and Marion spent 60 years learning lessons that modern couples need to learn in 5. And that gap, that compression of time, isn't just about people being impatient now. It's about the fact that Robert and Marion learned these lessons slowly because they had no choice but to stay and figure it out. They couldn't keep score forever because they were stuck in the same house for decades. They had to accept each other's personality differences because divorce wasn't a real option. They learned to speak up about resentments because silence was poisoning them and there was no exit door. They tended the marriage when it went on autopilot because what else were they going to do at 65? Start over. They remembered they were on the same team because they had a shared history so deep that being opponents would mean negating their entire adult life. Every single lesson they learned is true. But every single lesson was learned under duress. And that changes what we can extract from their story. What Robert and Marian are offering you isn't a roadmap for how to stay married for 60 years. It's a catalog of what happens when you wait too long to address the thing that's slowly killing your relationship. They kept score for 15 years before stopping. They fought about personality differences for 40 years before accepting each other. They let resentments build until they exploded. They let their marriage run on autopilot for years before course-correcting. They forgot they were partners until a crisis reminded them. They're not telling you how to do it right. They're telling you what happens when you do it wrong and stay anyway. And here's the uncomfortable truth: most of their lessons are about how to tolerate, endure, and eventually adapt to problems that modern couples might reasonably choose to leave over. Stop keeping score? Modern couples have apps that split expenses to the penny because financial autonomy matters, and nobody wants to be financially trapped the way Marian was. Accept who your partner is? Modern couples increasingly believe that growth and evolution are part of the deal, that you're allowed to ask your partner to work on themselves. Speak up before you explode? Modern couples have access to therapy that teaches them this in month 1. Tend your marriage? Modern couples are drowning in content telling them to prioritize their relationship. Remember you're a team? Modern couples know this. The question is whether they want to be on this particular team with this particular person. The synthesis isn't that Robert and Marian figured it out. The synthesis is that they stayed long enough for the staying itself to become the point. And there's something profound in that. There's also something we need to be honest about. Modern couples face a version of this that Robert and Marian never had to navigate: genuine choice. You can leave. You can start over. You can decide that the person you married at 25 isn't the person you want to be married to at 40, and the world won't exile you for it. You have access to therapy, to frameworks for understanding attachment and conflict, to language for emotional needs that didn't exist in 1964. And you have the economic reality that makes just focus on your relationship feel like advice from another planet, because you're both working, you're both exhausted, and the structural supports that let Robert and Marian build their marriage don't exist anymore. The question isn't whether Robert and Marian's lessons are true. The question is, are these the problems you want to spend 60 years solving with this person? I want to return to Robert and Marian one more time, not as case studies, but as people. Because here's what their 60 years represents: even with all the context and complications we've named, two human beings who chose each other in 1964 and are still choosing each other in 2026. They've buried friends. They've survived losses. They've watched their son's marriage collapse while their own marriage held. They've changed so much from who they were on that church dance floor in Scranton, and they've changed together. That's not nothing. That's not something to dismiss because we have better therapy now or because their generation had fewer options. What they've done, staying curious about each other for 6 decades, staying tender even through the resentment and the silence and the scorekeeping, that's real. But here's what costs us something: pretending their world and ours are the same. Pretending that advice formed under the weight of divorce isn't an option translates cleanly to a world where divorce is an option and sometimes the right one. We lose something when we erase the context. We romanticize suffering. We make younger people feel like they're failing because they can't tolerate what Robert and Marian tolerated. And we also lose something when we throw their wisdom away entirely. We tell ourselves that because the structure of their marriage was shaped by inequality, nothing they learned matters. Both of those moves cost us. The work is holding both truths at once. If you're watching this and you recognized your own relationship in one of Robert's mistakes, the scorekeeping, the resentment, the silence that builds into explosion, sit with that. Not with shame. With curiosity. Ask yourself, am I making this mistake because I haven't learned the lesson yet, or am I making this mistake because something in this relationship isn't working and I keep trying to fix it instead of facing it? Those are different problems. They require different solutions. Robert and Marian stayed and fixed it. That was right for them. It might not be right for you. And both of those can be true without either of you being wrong. Here's what I want you to take from their 60 years, updated for the life you're actually living. Stop counting contributions, start naming what you need. Not I do more than you, but I need to feel valued, and here's what that looks like for me. Accept who your partner is, and tell them who you're becoming. You don't have to change them. You also don't have to stay small to avoid threatening them. Say the hard thing before it becomes the explosive thing, but say the real thing underneath the complaint. Not you forgot the milk, but I need to matter to you. And when you forget, I feel erased. Tend your marriage, but don't mistake busyness for connection. Find the smallest unit of attention that feels like oxygen. 10 minutes of real presence beats an elaborate date night you're both too exhausted to enjoy. Remember you're on the same team, but make sure you're playing the same game. Being partners means you've agreed on what you're building together and you've agreed that both people's needs matter in the building of it. I want to know which of these 5 landed hardest for you and why. Not which one sounds nice in theory, which one made you feel something, made you recognize yourself or your relationship or your parents' marriage. Drop that in the comments. And if you grew up watching an elder couple navigate their marriage, your grandparents, your neighbors, the couple at church who'd been together forever, tell me what you learned from watching them. What did they get right? What do you wish they'd known? What are you doing differently because of what you saw in their relationship? If this felt different from the marriage advice you usually see, if it felt like someone was finally being honest about the gap between what worked in 1964 and what works now, subscribe. This channel exists because elder wisdom matters and because context matters, and we're not willing to sacrifice one for the other. Here's the closing truth, and it's the reason this work matters. You cannot build a modern relationship on outdated advice, and you cannot build a lasting relationship by ignoring everyone who came before you. The answer is translation. The answer is honoring what Robert and Marian learned through 60 years of dailiness and updating it for the world where you have choices they didn't have, language they didn't have, and freedoms they couldn't imagine. Their marriage survived. Yours deserves to thrive.